Welcome back to Women of Nottingham. I'm your host, Catherine, and this week for the podcast, we spoke to Micha Bradshaw. She is an activist in the city and she's a wonderful, wonderful woman. She speaks about her trauma that she experienced as a young girl and how that drove her to fight for change in the city. She was one of the key players in the misogyny law that came about a couple of years ago. She also talks about rebuilding after COVID and how we all just need to be a little bit more compassionate. It's a really, really powerful chat, and I feel very honoured that she shared her story with us, so please do listen on. There is a trigger warning in place here as she talks about rape, trauma, and self-harm briefly.
So my name is Micha Bradshaw. I have a history of working in activism, specialising in areas of around women. I've done work in the family courts on the Misogyny Campaign. And now I work providing holistic products for people to help them in an alternative manner through their healing journey.
How did you start getting into this? Is this something that you've always wanted to do? Is this something that came about because you felt that the service wasn't there? Or was it a personal experience?
It was very personal, yeah. So I grew up in a domestic abusive household. I then went on to have experiences at a very young age of abuse and rape. And so it sort of fed into my life in a really heavy way. And I guess with these things that happen to you, you either take them negatively, you forget them, or you use them to work to change the world around you and help people that have perhaps been through similar things. So that's how it started for me. It was about the healing that I'd worked on in my earlier years as a teenager and early 20s, and how I shared that with other people and that experience. So it started with connecting with people that had been through similar things, and then from that it grew into a job, a role, so to speak, and that's manifested in different ways. I've been lucky to work with the Women's Centre and Majatu, various different places across the city supporting women that have been through similar things around rape and abuse. So that's kind of how it started for me.
And would you mind going into your healing process a bit and how that sort of manifested?
So I was 11 when I was raped. I didn't tell anybody about it until I was a teenager, and it then kind of hit me in a really dark and heavy way. And I was extremely suicidal, I was self-harming, and it was kind of like a moment of an ultimatum of like, this can completely kill you, or you can use this as fuel. And I chose to use it as fuel. And so, yeah, from then on, I had, the usual things that you would associate with healing, things like therapy. I had anger management for a short period of time because it manifested a lot of anger in my body that I couldn't get justice for the things that had happened to me. And I think these things can either make you bitter or better, and I spent a lot of time being very bitter. And then I thought, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to be better, because that way, these people don't win. And it just sort of, it went on from there. Peer support was a huge thing. Being around women and in that feminine energy that holds a lot of power in healing together. And from that then developed into more sort of an actual role, running peer support groups that initially started at the Women's Centre, and then I did some other peer support groups around the family court experience for domestic abuse survivors. I think there's so many different levels of healing. I think healing, definitely has to be, ultimately, it comes from within. You can be mad at the injustice, and you can be frustrated with a justice system that doesn't work in any way to some degree, especially if you're a woman or somebody of colour, or you can start actively getting out there and sharing your story and sharing your voice and fighting against, so to speak, and bringing new ideas to how this change can happen. The initial process was very much like anger and this isn't right and that isn't right, and then I reached a point of where I wanted to create more of a solution and healing, as opposed to, because it is easy to sort of dwell in the injustices of it all, because there's so many.
And something I've heard with activists in a similar position is that sometimes it can be actually quite hard to do all this work because it can be re-traumatizing. Is that something that you've found, or is it something actually that maybe it empowers you the other way, or perhaps both?
Absolutely, no. So it is a really re-traumatizing thing, and I think that is something that I definitely learned the hard way when I was lucky enough to go to campaign boot camp, which is a campaign training place where you go. It was like, people from all over the place on all different types of campaigns, and you live together and you eat together and you campaign together. And it's like a micro society of the world outside, and we touched upon that several times, in terms of, because with activism you will have an idea and it will feel like it will give you hope. It will give you hope that this thing can change, and you go out there and some people will hear you and some people will not hear you, and some people will completely dismiss you and challenge you. And when you are going out there and protesting or campaigning for something that's so personal to your own experiences or to the people that are around you, it can definitely become very draining very quickly. Self-care, not just all the fluffy stuff, but taking time to be really honest with yourself about how that's impacting you is definitely important, and that is something that I did learn the hard way. I was so sort of full of passion to change the things. I have a daughter myself, and I didn't want her, the fuel for that was, I don't want her to have these experiences in society. I felt in a very heavy way from the moment my rape happened when I was 11, that it happened because of the way that I was perceived. I developed breasts and looked like a young woman very early, and I remember being wolf whistled at, and older men looking at me. And so when my rape happened at 11, I thought it was absolutely my fault, that I had boobs, so it must be me. And so then working towards trying to campaign against things like misogyny, and carrying your story and hearing other people's stories, it can, if you're not careful, it can get you into a really depressed state, frankly.
No, I think it just shows that people like yourself are so vital and wonderful, because you have put your mental health at risk in the hope of changing, so that what happened to you doesn't happen to somebody else, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I have definitely struggled with my mental health as a result of the things that happened to me. And that's not something that I've been very open about that. And I've always and will always be open about that. You don't go through some of the things that I've been through and not be impacted at all, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. Trauma, there's an amazing book called The Body Keeps the Score by Basil van der Kolk, and trauma holds in your body. And so it's not just about, there's stages to this. I think the stages for me were sort of voicing it, this anger, projecting that anger, and then using that pain for power ultimately. So I think with all the will in the world, you can have an idea and want to change things, and that's great. But I think the people that are around you make a huge difference, and it's really important to be mindful of that, of who you have around you that's working with you, what their purpose is, and taking time to celebrate however small the win is, when those wins happen, and they are few and far between, especially if you're campaigning around women's work, they're really few and far between, believe it or not. I don't know whether that's shocking for anyone to hear. But yes, when you do have that little moment of a win or a victory, whether it's you've got an additional signature for your petition, or you went out sharing flyers and had lots of positive conversations, whatever those wins are, it's important that you celebrate them personally, but then you celebrate them in the unity. And it's definitely the unity of women coming together through that helped me. Equally, it's important to be mindful of the fact that if you are especially doing work in areas of abuse and rape and things like that, that there are potentially a lot of unhealed people, and that's not, everybody's healing. Nobody's healed. That's a really important thing that I'd like. There's no, everybody is always healing. We're always healing something. We're always working on something. So I think it's important to be mindful of, when you are in those groups, that there are unhealed people there, and sometimes your wounds can bleed out on them, and their wounds can bleed out on you, and taking time to reflect on that and discuss that in a safe way is really important. It's a really important part of the process, definitely.
And you were saying that the wins are few and far between, but you have been at the core of some really big wins in recent history and also just generally. So you worked on the Misogyny Campaign in Notts, you were mentioning earlier, and that was really successful. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the campaign was led by a lot of people in Nottingham. I was one of many. It wasn't just me. I'd like to make that very clear. Lots of fantastic people worked on the campaign, and because of my story from sort of start to finish, and the work that I've done throughout, I was asked to speak to the law commissioners who had come to Nottingham to decide on if we were to make misogyny a law, misogynistic actions towards women unlawful in Nottingham. And I was lucky. It was a very surreal experience to stand in front of a panel of law commissioners and like chief of police and people like that, and say, you failed me. It was quite a surreal experience, but also massively empowering. There was me and a few other women that shared some really awful stories of experiences that they'd had, and why we thought that misogyny would change. And as I alluded to earlier, it's definitely this different society, this even subtle societal things that we allow, and we allow a lot more to certain people than we do others, that impact that narrative of how you accept or reject something. And being 11 and having breasts and having older men gorp at you, that had a big impact on how I then later reacted to the rape and abuse that happened to me later. And then, it's not just those things, it's when you then go to report these things, the response that's happened. We hear time and time again things like, what were you wearing, and were you drunk, and all of these things are encompassing to how you then move forward with getting justice and healing in a huge way. But yeah, the Misogyny Campaign was a very surreal experience, but very empowering, and I felt very blessed to be a part of that, because you spend a lot of time when these things happen to you thinking, like, why did they happen? And obviously, grotesque, not nice, cruel people is why they happen, but also, like, how do I use this? How does this manifest into my life, into who I am and my identity? And I do feel quite grateful that I have been able to turn turn it around to feed my life and my being in a positive way. Like it does fuel me. It gives me drive to not give up, to be resilient, to keep pushing for change in different areas. You know, my approach is now more humanity as a whole, as opposed to just specific genders. And that's, I guess, because of, you know, where we are with everything at the moment. I don't think humanity as a whole is being treated very greatly. But yeah.
And the misogyny, sort of making misogyny illegal, to paraphrase it, what does that mean? Why is that important? Because I think some people, when it came out, perhaps said that it was more sort of symbolic. And to me, symbolic actually is 100% a win in itself. But what does it actually physically mean for women in the city?
So, as I alluded to earlier, there's almost, I think of it as like the spectrum of misogyny. And so I guess that, you know, the lower end could be, you know, the all right, love, wolf whistle out of a van. And the opposite far end of that could be, you know, a woman locked up in a house being beaten up and abused. And the idea is that that spectrum encompasses the way that we acknowledge, respect and treat women in society. You know, the more you allow the lower end stuff, the more the sort of upper end stuff becomes more acceptable. You know, there is misogyny as a concept is like one of the oldest things, so to speak. You know, it's the hate of women, and yeah, you know, you see it time and time again. I know, like with the family court work that I've done, you know, hysterical women. Hysteria literally means crazy womb, basically. So our society, so to speak, you know, the laws that we've had made are made by white, male, rich men. They're not made by women. They're not made by black women. They're not, you know, there's no, so how can they serve those people ultimately? The laws that have been made to serve the people that created them. And so, yes, the misogyny law campaign work that was done in Nottingham, it was very symbolic. It made a big footmark to say, actually, we're doing something. This is a start point. And some people wanted more and some people wanted less. You know, some people were really angry. I had even like cousins that were like, oh, you know, I've just bought a van and I can't wolf whistle women now because of you. You know, like making jokes like that. And joking aside, like you carry those things as a woman. You know, I was 11 when I was carrying comments about my breasts and weird looks from older men. Those things feed into your brain, into your conscious and subconscious, and you think that that's acceptable. And so then the lines are blurred of where you even draw that line of what's acceptable and what's not. So the misogyny law sort of put a stop in that to say, actually, let's be a bit more mindful the way we approach and speak to women, because we're not. We just aren't. You know, you go to a bar, you're at the bar, you'll be asked about 20 times if you want to drink, and if you don't want to drink, then you're a bitch. And that's normal. That's just a normal thing. But the reality is, it's not normal. You know, no human, male, female, whatever gender they relate or identify to, deserves to be treated like that. It's, you know, it's about a sense of humanity and compassion that is very much lost as a whole, I feel, at the moment. But historically has been low existing to women and people of colour.
And I was going to pick up actually when you said about going to the law commissioners. And did you see anybody that looked like you or even vaguely had the similar experience looking back at you on that panel?
I believe there was one, perhaps two women, but I think the law commissioners that came there was one woman, but they were all white. And, you know, these things do matter. You know, you can only identify so much with something, if you haven't experienced it, if you haven't walked in those shoes, then you can't you can't recognize what people have been through. And so it's a very outdated way that I'm hoping, with the things that are happening in the world right now, there'll be some shifts and ripples for these things to be looked at in a different way. But it is, the world ultimately and unfortunately, to the impact of women and people of colour, is run by white rich men. And they make the rules and they change the rules, but if they're the ones that are changing them, are they ever going to support a society that's encompassing of everyone and their rights here as human beings?
The other thing that I thought was really interesting is it makes complete sense, but I've never heard misogyny described as a spectrum before, in terms of it almost being sort of a gateway thing, right? That if something's acceptable, then it doesn't really matter where it stops. And I think that's such a powerful way of explaining to your cousins, for example, why it's not okay to catcall out of a van.
I guess you think of it as like this drip feed. So, the most time it becomes prevalent, and I'm sure you've probably experienced it yourself, as many other young girls and women have, that when you start hitting puberty and you start getting breasts and, you curve out more, and, that's sort of where you start with this empty bucket, and the drip of water into that bucket is the "you're right sexy," or "show us your boobs," or, and then as you get older, it's "let me buy you that drink." "I don't want that drink." "Okay, stupid bitch," these things. And every time that happens, there's this drip. Or whether it's that man that stares you out on the tram the entire time you're there, making you feel completely uncomfortable, it's normal. It's like, almost like, you're a walking zoo there for observation, to anyone's will as they wish. And that's this drip feed, drips until, the bucket is full, and you've accepted that is how you are treated in society, and that's how society accepts you, and that's how society reacts to you. And the reality is, it's not normal, it isn't normal, and it's something that I really try, in as a delicate way as I can, instill into my daughter, for example. So, when we go out and we visit people, a big thing I remember when I was younger was hug them, give them a hug, give them a kiss, say goodbye. And it was like a forced thing, like, do that. My daughter will say, "I don't want to hug you because my mommy says if I don't feel that I want to, I don't have to. This is my sacred space." And it's just little things like that drip feed, into your brain, in the same way that the things in the media do, and that it ends up rotting your brain and your perceptions of how you respect yourself and how you allow other people to respect you.
Do you think having your daughter has reignited a lot of your concerns or a lot of your drive to get things to change? Or do you think it's actually changed how you feel about anything at all?
I think when you become a parent, you look at life completely differently anyway. And so you do look at the future and think, what am I leaving for my child? There's definitely an urge in me to support humanity into healing, into finding more compassion for one another, and my little girl, is the driving force for that. But sometimes she's the one that's driving that force herself. I absolutely believe, regardless of what I do, in her and her ability as a person. But yeah, it definitely it definitely changes your perspective. It gives you a bit more of a boost for change, a boost for reflection. You know, you check yourself, you check the world, you think about what is going to be left behind, without a doubt. Of course, you know, I don't want my daughter to ever go through any of the things that I've been through. But I also feel, and it may sound quite strange, that she won't, because of the things, you know, the start to life and the lessons that you learn along the way. You know, I spoke about the little drip feeds of information that you carry and out into society and project into what your perception of the world is and what you allow. Yeah, I believe in her, and I believe that generationally now, I think that kids and younger people are just more advanced in terms of wanting to make that change earlier. I think historically you saw people wanting to, you know, make changes for humanity in the world a lot later on in their lives, and now you see children at a lot younger ages, you know, caring about the environment, you know, campaigning even, and so that instills hope in me. Yeah.
I'm sure she's very proud to have you as her mum.
Ah, yeah, sometimes.
Well, you're still her mum, so you're still telling her to eat vegetables.
Yeah. All the time, because I'm plant-based, so she gets quite fed up of it, actually. And she's not, so she's like, oh, gosh,
more
vegan.
Spinach. And you were saying about moving more to humanity, and obviously there is so much struggle in humanity at the moment. What do you think we need to do to be kinder to each other? What is the next step coming out of coronavirus, with all of our fingers crossed? Hopefully that is on the cards. What do you think we can do to be better?
Well, I think there used to be this big push, and obviously as an activist that worked in women's work, and I'm not saying that there's no space for that anymore. You know, women and people of colour are very, very, very far behind in terms of equality in the world and access to resources, justice, you know, everything. They're far, far behind, without a doubt. But I do feel that the more we create this society of good versus bad or left versus right, and I'm not saying that I'm going to ever support the Tories, that's not what I'm saying, ever. But I think there needs to be more a sort of a middle ground in terms of unity. And, like, you know, we're all here. Ultimately, everything is just our perception, really. It is literally just our perception. There's no one truth or one, you know, this is right, that is wrong, really. That doesn't exist. So I think, you know, we have seen the impact that the rules and the laws and the lockdowns and COVID and all these different things have had. And yes, it's been a tough time. But I think, you know, when we've had people, you know, the domestic violence rates are absolutely through the roof now, because people have been locked in the house with, you know, refuges were full before lockdown even started. And yet we still have locked women in houses with abusive men. We've locked children away. Child abuse has gone up. You know, all of these things that we're seeing whilst we then see, you know, public figures in authority going out shooting and having high tea lunches and things like that. I think we're moving to a place where we do need structure, so to speak, as a society. Yeah, you know, there has to be, it can't just be a free-for-all, but I do now feel we've moved to a place where the governments that serve us aren't particularly fit for purpose at this present moment in time. The things that have been allowed in terms of, you know, things like the spy bill, the discussions of not allowing people to travel, the issues around EU and Brexit, where becoming really close to being a really destructive society that has no freedom, and we're almost allowing it to happen, and that's quite disturbing. I think there needs to be, the media's got a lot to answer for that. Mainstream media does have a lot to answer for, in terms of the fear that instills in people, and some of the stories that are allowed to run have just been sort of ignored, and that's quite disheartening. So I feel like moving forward, working to a middle ground of, I might not believe what you believe, but you are allowed to believe that because that's your perception and that's your life. Working to a sort of middle ground of acceptance and compassion, and breaking it back down to, the where we started, so to speak, in terms of humanity. And things like Micha do it out in the farm, in the countryside, growing crops together, little things like that, getting out into nature, having unity as opposed to I'm left, you're right, this is right, you're wrong. I think the way forward is that, and I do, unfortunately feel that, we've outgrown the systems that govern us, so to speak, and I know that's probably quite an out there perception, but we've outgrown them, and if the world is forever ran, as it has been up to this date, by white rich men that dig oil and start wars and make laws and rules that suit them, there'll be nothing left of the planet, and we're seeing that already. The impact to the climate, from the fact that we just all we seem to care about as a society is more money, and that's not driven really by us. That's been fed to us to think that that's what we do need to desire as human beings, and we don't. To feel whole and to feel as a part of something, we need to feel connected to one another. We need to feel connected to nature, and that means being mindful and conscious of nature and people, and we seem to have lost that in this capitalist driven society of rich white men at the top telling people down below through this drip feed system of how they need to live their lives. So I think the more people that sort of stand up against that, moving forward, the better. And togetherness with one another, instead of focusing on the left, right, wrong concepts, accept that everything is just a perception and nobody really has a bloody clue why we were put onto earth, ultimately. We don't, and what we're here for. So instead of focusing in on, that person said this and I believe that, let's connect back to the things that we have in common more and have more unity. And I believe that will ultimately start feeding our the consciousness of us and the consciousness of the planet, and we'll work to a place of having more respect for it instead of feeding from it and draining it like people in higher power do us.
There's a lot more to do.
Yeah, so hopefully that's a brief summary and everyone will understand.
So you're going to do that single-handedly, right?
Yeah, just me alone. No, I think it has to be a unity of people, and I do think, we are getting there. People are more conscious of themselves and of the things around them. People are trying to be more sustainable, and yeah, of course, we are small fish in a big pond ultimately. What we need to do, these people that are wanting to be more sustainable, wanting more compassion, wanting more unity, need to come together to then take on, big oil companies, big corporations and businesses that are ultimately the things that run our lives. Everything goes back to corporations, and Thanks.
Well, I'm sure there's lots of people that are very willing to help you out with that. And I think it's just a case of listening to each other more, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just having having compassion and just listening. You're not here to always speak. You're here to observe as well.
Compassion is never going to be a bad thing. And the one question that I finish all these podcasts off with, although now we put the worlds to rights, it does feel a little bit redundant, is what do you think the most remarkable thing about being a woman is?
The most remarkable thing about being a woman is, I actually was asked this once by Harmless. They did like a photo exhibition of women in Nottingham, and I was asked this question, and I think that it's the ability to you fall down a lot as a woman for lots of different reasons. You know, you carry a lot, and I think the marvelous thing about being a woman is you have this, how to describe it into a word really, this ingrained ability to just get back up again and to keep going, and I think that's a very powerful thing that women have, and should never ever forget.
Thank you for that, and thank you so much for sharing your story and coming on and talking to us today.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
And if people want to find you, where can they find you? Or if they want to maybe find out a little bit more about the activism work that's going on?
Well, I am a lot more quiet these days. My business page is Wicker Kitchen, which is my holistic healing page. But in terms of activism, for now, I am quiet. There are, if you search Mindfully Micha or Micha Bradshaw on Google, lots of different things come up about me, to be honest. A few articles I've written, a few campaigns that I've been involved in. So yeah, if you do a good old Google search of me, I'll pop up. But yeah, I don't have a particular dedicated personal Instagram page or anything like that anymore. Yeah, just my business page now.
Sounds like you're busy enough.
Yeah, quite busy.
Well, thank you so much. Honestly, it was a great chat, and I know lots of people will be really, really empowered and heard by listening to this.
Great. That's what we want. So thank you for having me.
That was wonderful. Micha Bradshaw there on Women of Nottingham. I thought that was a really powerful chat, and I hope you guys enjoyed and learned as much as I did. So please do listen in next week for another wonderful Women of Nottingham.